Okay, so this is the sixth video lecture on the topic of lifespan development. In this one, I want to talk about adulthood, but before I switch the slides, I realized was a really important point that I didn't make, and that is that another thing that happens in adolescence and is perfectly normal and yes, is perfectly developmentally normative is this is the time where our parents become less important, and we turn away from our parents and turn towards peers. This creates a lot of conflict, obviously. If you when your parents and you start to get into an argument and they say, they don't like you hanging out with certain people, but developmentally, this is exactly what is supposed to happen during adolescence: is the shift in whose opinion matters the most. It can be really heartbreaking to be the parent, and it can create a lot of conflict, but it's exactly normal. As is this next stage. This is the topic of adulthood. So one of the things that's happened in the West, and I say in the Western Hemisphere, is that adulthood or young adulthood, well, how do I say this? The time between childhood and family formation is getting longer and longer. And so in some textbooks, or there you go, there's the way to say it, the delaying of adult responsibility. And what I mean by the delaying of adult responsibility, the fact that Americans are getting married later than ever before, they're having children later than ever before, more people are having no children, that this is historically a new trend, that as we delay family formation and delay adults, that actually this stage in life between puberty, between adulthood and adolescence, that is actually changing the name. And so some textbooks will refer to this as emerging adulthood or young adulthood. There's another term that I've heard called adult essence, and it takes the root word adult and adolescence. My son would fall into this category. He is a 28-year-old man. He has a full-time job and financially supports himself, but he lives in our basement, and he spends his money on things like investing in VR equipment and video games. He's both an adult, but he's also living like an adolescent. And depending upon which philosophy or which philosophical bent, this is either a good thing or it's a bad thing. On one hand, it's an indication that our culture is wealthy. Okay, so some would argue that this is because our culture has economically advanced, that my child doesn't need to be out making money so he can financially support me, and that I'm financially secure enough that I can support him. Other arguments are no, it's actually a sign that we are not wealthy, that our children are not leaving home because they can't afford to leave home, because when they were living at home, they became accustomed to a certain standard of living, and they can't maintain that standard of living on their own. There's also the argument that they're just lazy, and that we did raise them to a certain standard of living, and they're unwilling to lower their standard of living and take on the responsibility of family formation. So depending on which philosophy you embrace, but nevertheless the trend is that young people are living at home longer, and they are delaying marriage and family formation. So again, this asks the question, and I don't know why it actually happens to be here, seedling to redwood tree or caterpillar to butterfly. I'm not sure why it's here. We generally can think of adulthood as broken down into these three different times. You have early adulthood, 20s to your 30s, middle adulthood, which would be me. This year I am 50 years old this year. I turn 51, 21. Later on, middle adulthood to age 65, late adulthood. And then in some textbooks, they talk about old, and the very old. So anyway, depending upon. And it's kind of unfortunate that we put it into one little slide here. A couple things happen, different stages in life, a couple really important points that are mentioned in your textbook, and that's this phenomena right here of telomeres. So that's what this illustration is supposed to be. At the end of our DNA, at the end of our DNA are these little caps, and they're referred to as telomeres. You can think of them like the plastic part at the end of a shoestring. Every time our cell divides, those telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. So effectively, what aging is as these telomeres, and at some point, when these telomeres are gone because they've gotten so short, that's when cells begin to die. So our cells can only divide a certain number of times. When we get to the chapter on stress, I'm going to talk. I believe I have another conversation about telomeres and the topic on stress, because stress actually causes those telomeres to rot. So, a person who lives a life, an adult lifetime of lots of stress, their telomeres will get shorter, and in essence, they will age faster than someone who hasn't lived a stressful lifetime. But the point is that our cells can only divide a certain number of times. That we can, neurogenesis, going back to chapter 2, is a phenomena of where the cells can replace themselves. That depending on how we have lived our young adulthood or how we have lived our life up until middle to late adulthood, may predict how well we age. Other things that happen, of course, with adulthood is we have fertility changes. The average onset for a woman for her periods to cease, for her to be no longer reproductive, is 50 years old. Actually, I think it might be 51. Your definition of menopause is 12 consecutive months without a menstrual cycle. Men's fertility begins to decline too, but never ceases the same way a woman's does. And of course, you've got other things like hearing loss, vision loss. One of the cool things I think about how the brain changes with age is there's some evidence that the amygdala, you remember the amygdala is that emotional center, is the one that responds to stressful events. There's some evidence that says it atrophies, that it gets smaller, and that results in older people responding less harshly, or they're slower to respond to negative events, they're slower to anger, and they're quicker to forget negative events. So I think that's kind of cool. What else can I tell you about some of the physical changes with age? Your muscles begin to atrophy. For me, the big one that I'm aware of is my hearing loss, but I also attribute that to all the concerts that I've gone to. Okay, so again, we want to talk about some of the social changes that happen in adulthood. One thing I think it's really important to point out is what's commonly referred to as the midlife crisis. I want to emphasize that or point out that this is in fact a myth. There is, of course, we go through a midlife transition, but it need not be a time of crisis for people. My battery is going to die, so I think I'm going to pick this one up when I come back.